The village of Black Hollow was small, tucked away in a valley surrounded by thick, ancient woods. Few travelers ever passed through, and even fewer stayed. It was a place where time seemed to hold its breath, where the air was thick with secrets whispered through the trees. At night, Black Hollow was swallowed by darkness. The only thing keeping it at bay was the lanterns, tall, iron fixtures lining the dirt roads, flickering against the encroaching blackness. They were never allowed to go out. Not once. The villagers spoke of old horrors that crept in the dark, things that slithered from the woods when the light was gone. They never described them fully, perhaps because they didn't know, or perhaps because those who had seen them never lived to tell. For as long as anyone could remember, there had been a lantern keeper. His job was sacred. He walked the village from sundown to sunrise, trimming the wicks, filling the lamps, and ensuring the flames never faltered. But the last keeper, old Thomas Grady, had passed. His heart simply stopped one night, found slumped over his lantern cart, a spent match still clenched in his fingers. And so the village hired a new keeper. He arrived on the 1st of November, when the air had turned crisp and brittle, carrying the scent of decaying leaves. He was a tall man, wrapped in a long, tattered coat, his face half hidden beneath the brim of an old hat. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but firm. "My name is Elias Crow," he said, "and I will keep the lanterns burning." There was something unsettling about him, but the villagers did not question his arrival. They only cared that the lights remained lit. And for weeks Elias did his duty. Every night, without fail, he walked the streets, tending to the lanterns with meticulous care. Some villagers watched him from their windows. How he moved with eerie precision, how his shadow twisted strangely against the cobblestones. But they did not interfere. Then, on the eve of the winter solstice, something went wrong. It started with one lantern. The widow, Margaret Holloway, was the first to notice. She had woken in the night, peering through her lace curtains, and saw the nearest lantern flickering wildly. Then, without warning, it went out. Margaret felt a chill creep up her spine. She had never seen one go out before, not ever. She wanted to look away, to return to bed and pretend she had seen nothing. But something moved in the darkness where the light had died. A shifting shape. Something tall. Something wrong. Margaret's breath hitched. The shape slithered closer. She tore herself from the window, clutching the rosary at her throat, and shut her eyes. She did not sleep that night, and she was not the only one who saw. Throughout the village, whispers spread like wildfire. More lanterns flickered, struggling against an unseen force. The air grew colder, the night heavier. And then, as if summoned by the rising fear, Elias Crow vanished. On the night of the solstice, no one saw the lantern keeper make his rounds. His lantern cart stood abandoned near the village square, a single broken match lying beside it. And one by one the lanterns sputtered out. The darkness swallowed Black Hollow whole. Then, from the woods, something stirred. Something ancient. Something hungry. And the screams began. The village of Black Hollow had never known true darkness. Not until now. It started with a single lantern, a flickering flame that shuddered and died. Then another, and another. By midnight, the last lantern had gone out. The village was swallowed whole. For the first time in 100 years, Black Hollow lay defenseless against the things that lurked in the dark. And the lantern keeper was nowhere to be found. Margaret Holloway had been the first to see the darkness creeping in, but she was not the first to scream. That honor belonged to Jacob Finch, the village butcher. He had been closing up his shop when he noticed the lantern outside his door go out. At first he thought nothing of it. Perhaps a gust of wind had blown it out, though the air had been eerily still. Then he heard it. A whisper. It came from the alley beside his shop, soft and slithering, curling around his ears like a breath against his skin. Jacob turned slowly, his heart pounding. A figure stood in the alley. No, not a figure. A shape. Something shifting, moving in ways a body should not. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs stretched and wrong. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, gleamed like wet stones in the dark. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He tried to step back, but his feet would not obey. The thing in the alley tilted its head, as if listening. Then it lunged. The butcher's scream tore through the night, sharp and sudden. It was cut off just as quickly. By the time the villagers arrived, drawn by the sound, they found only blood. A slick, black trail leading into the woods. Jacob Finch was gone. Panic spread through Black Hollow like wildfire. Doors were bolted, windows latched. No one dared step outside without a lantern of their own. But even those flames seemed weaker now, struggling against the thick, pressing dark. The village elders, led by Sheriff William Hargrove, gathered in the town hall, their faces grim. "We need to find the lantern keeper," Hargrove said. "If we don't get those lights back on, we're all dead." But Elias Crow was missing. His lantern cart remained in the square, untouched. His room at the inn was empty, his bed unslept in. It was as if he had simply vanished. "Perhaps he ran," suggested Thomas Bell, the blacksmith. "He saw what was coming and fled." "No," said Margaret Holloway, her voice trembling. "I don't think he ran. I think they took him." Silence fell over the room. No one wanted to ask the question hanging in the air. Who were they? And if they had taken Elias Crow, was he even still alive? Hargrove made his decision quickly. He would not wait for morning. There was no guarantee they would see another morning. He gathered a small group of men, each armed with lanterns, torches, and whatever weapons they could carry. They would search for Elias Crow. And they would start in the woods. The search party moved cautiously, their lanterns casting long, shivering shadows against the trees. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. No birds, no wind, only the sound of their boots against the frost-covered earth. Then, a rustling. Hargrove raised his lantern. "Who's there?" Silence. Then another sound, this one worse. A wet, dragging noise, like something being pulled through the leaves. The men tightened their grips on their weapons. "Stay together," Hargrove whispered. "Don't wander off." But someone already had. Paul Weaver had been near the back of the group, holding his lantern with shaky hands. He thought he heard something behind him. A whisper. A name. "Paul." His breath hitched. He turned. Nothing. Just trees. Just dark. Then, just behind the last tree, a shape moved. A shadow within the shadows. His pulse pounded in his throat. "Hello!" His voice was barely more than a breath. The thing stepped closer. A wrongness filled the air, thick and heavy, pressing against his skin. Paul tried to scream, but a hand clamped over his mouth. The last thing he saw was the lantern slipping from his fingers, its flame dying as it hit the earth. The darkness swallowed him whole. By the time the others noticed Paul was missing, it was too late. Hargrove called his name, but only silence answered. Then the whispering began. Soft, slithering voices, curling around them from every direction. The men raised their lanterns high, but the light barely cut through the gloom. The shadows seemed thicker here, moving like living things. Then they saw them. Shapes in the trees. Tall, twisted, watching. Hargrove's breath came fast. "Run." The men turned and ran, stumbling through the dark, their lanterns swinging wildly. The shadows moved with them, whispering, laughing. A cold hand brushed against Thomas Bell's neck. He screamed and dropped his lantern. The darkness surged forward. One by one, their lights went out. One by one, their screams fell silent. Hargrove ran until his legs burned. He did not look back. By the time he reached the edge of the woods, he was alone. And the village of Black Hollow was doomed. Margaret Holloway was waiting when Hargrove stumbled back into the village. His clothes torn, his face pale with terror. She knew, before he even spoke, that the others were gone. "They took them," he gasped. "They took all of them." The remaining villagers huddled together, gripping their lanterns, their only defense against the creeping dark. But the flames were weaker now. The night was winning. And somewhere, in the depths of the woods, something laughed. Something old. Something hungry. And it was coming. The night stretched long and merciless over Black Hollow. Every lantern had died. Every shadow had deepened. And the horrors in the woods had drawn closer. Margaret Holloway stood in the village square, her fingers clenched tightly around the handle of a small, flickering oil lamp. It was the last light in the village. Sheriff William Hargrove was beside her, his face pale, his hands trembling. He had returned from the woods alone, the others swallowed by the dark. "We're not safe here," he muttered. "Not anymore." Around them, the remaining villagers huddled together. Mothers held their children close. Old men clutched rifles that suddenly felt useless. They all knew the truth. Without the lanterns, Black Hollow was doomed. And the lantern keeper was still missing. The first sign that the things in the woods had arrived was the whispering. It slithered through the air, curling through the empty streets, seeping through the cracks beneath doors. Low, hissing voices. Margaret gripped the lamp tighter, her breath shallow. Then came the shapes. They stood at the edge of the village, half hidden in the dark. Tall, thin figures that didn't move like men. Their limbs were too long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Watching, waiting. Then the first one stepped forward. Margaret gasped. The way it moved. It glided, smooth and silent, like it wasn't touching the ground at all. Another followed. Then another. The villagers pressed back against the church steps, their voices rising in terror. Hargrove raised his rifle, his hands slick with sweat. "Stay back!" The things did not stop. They were hungry. Suddenly, the church door burst open behind them. "Get inside!" It was Father Mathis, the village priest, his face lined with fear. He reached out, grabbing Margaret by the arm, pulling her through the doorway. The others followed in a desperate rush, shoving and stumbling into the candlelit church. As soon as the last villager crossed the threshold, Mathis slammed the door shut and threw the iron bolt across it. A second later, something slammed into the wood from the outside. The entire church trembled. The children screamed. Margaret backed away, her lamp flickering wildly in her grasp. Something dragged its nails or claws down the wooden door, a long, slow scratching sound that made her skin crawl. The whispering outside grew louder. Hargrove stepped forward, rifle still in hand, sweat trickling down his face. "They've never come this close before. They've never needed to," Margaret whispered. The lanterns had always kept them away. But now the lanterns were gone, and the village had nowhere left to run. Father Mathis turned, his eyes wild. "We have to find Elias Crow." "Crow is gone," Hargrove snapped. The priest shook his head. "No, he didn't run. He knew something was coming." Margaret looked at him sharply. "What are you saying?" Mathis hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Elias Crow came to me the day before he disappeared." The room fell silent. Hargrove narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Mathis swallowed hard. "He told me the lanterns weren't just for light. They were a barrier. A seal." Margaret felt a cold dread seep into her bones. "A seal against what?" The priest's voice trembled. "Against them." A long, slow creak filled the air. Everyone turned toward the church door. The wood was bending inward. Something was pushing against it. Mathis clenched his jaw. "Elias said something else before he left." "What?" Margaret whispered. The priest turned to her, his voice grave. "If the lanterns go out, nothing can stop them." The pounding at the church door grew harder. The walls groaned. The windows rattled in their frames. Then, a sound from above. A soft thump. Then another. Something was inside the church. Margaret sucked in a sharp breath. The bell tower. Hargrove looked up. His knuckles turned white around his rifle. "Shit." A long, slow scrape echoed from the wooden beams above. Something was moving in the rafters. Something watching them from the dark. A low, wet clicking sound filled the air. The villagers shrank back, clutching one another. Margaret tightened her grip on the oil lamp. The flame inside it flickered violently. Then, a shape dropped from the rafters. The thing landed on all fours, its limbs bending in ways that should have been impossible. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, its eyes gleaming like polished stones. Then it smiled. A mouth too wide, teeth too many. Margaret's breath hitched. It knew they were trapped. The thing took a step forward. Then another. It was playing with them. Margaret's hands trembled around the lamp. The flame was growing weaker. It was going to die. And when it did, so would they. Hargrove lifted his rifle, aiming at the creature's skull. "Stay back!" The thing laughed. A hollow, scraping sound, like wind through dead leaves. Then it lunged. A gunshot exploded in the air. The creature screeched, jerking back. The bullet had struck, but it did not fall. It only shuddered. Then it started to move again. Margaret's lamp sputtered. The flame was almost out. Then, in the flickering light, she saw something. Something on the creature's chest. A symbol. A burned-in mark, almost like. Margaret's stomach dropped. The same mark that had been carved into the lantern posts around the village. The symbol Elias Crow had been protecting. The one that kept them out. Margaret's breath came fast. The lanterns weren't just barriers. They were bindings. And without them, the creatures were free. She turned to Mathis, her voice desperate. "We have to find Elias. Now!" The priest's eyes widened. Then the lamp in her hands flickered one last time. And went out. The church was plunged into darkness. The whispering grew deafening. The last thing Margaret heard, before the screaming began, was the creature's laughter. And then the night devoured Black Hollow whole. The night was no longer silent. The village of Black Hollow, once a quiet haven nestled in the valley, had become a place of shrieks and nightmares. The flickering lamp in Margaret Holloway's hand had failed, plunging the church into complete darkness. The air was thick with the stink of fear, but something worse was approaching. An unnatural presence that was hungry for the souls within. They were out there, the creatures, the horrors, and they were closing in. When the lamp went out, it was as though the village had breathed its last breath. The whispering that had been creeping at the edges of their minds grew louder now. Closer. It slithered through the shadows, curling around their hearts, a promise of death. Margaret's hands trembled around the broken lamp. Her chest was tight, every inhale a struggle. She had no idea what was happening, only that the darkness was closing in, crushing her thoughts into silence. What happened to the lanterns? What happened to Elias Crow? Those were the questions that plagued her mind as the church around her seemed to pulse with the rhythm of something breathing, something alive. And then, a movement. In the pitch black she saw it, just a blur, but it was there. Something was shifting, a shape too large to be a human figure. She stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. Suddenly, a low growl broke the silence. It was impossible to tell where it came from. It echoed through the rafters, bounced off the cold stone walls, then curled into the corners of the room, filling every space with a terrifying weight. The creature was close. Margaret could feel it, its presence soaking the air like poison. "Father?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Father Mathis's voice answered from the shadows, strained and thin. "They're inside the church. We can't get out. We have to." The sound of his voice was suddenly cut off. Something heavy, something crushing, landed on the wooden floor of the church with a sickening thud. Then silence. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. Father Mathis? But she didn't have time to think. The shadows twisted around her, and the growling became louder. She could hear it, sniffing, like a predator picking up the scent of its prey. A sharp cry broke through the dark, and someone stumbled into her. Someone breathing heavily. "Margaret!" It was Hargrove. His voice was strained, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Where's Father Mathis?" she asked. His reply was all too quick, and his words almost tumbled over each other in his panic. "He's gone. Something dragged him off. We couldn't stop it." Margaret's stomach turned. The creatures were hunting them. They were inside the church. The doors were bolted shut, but it didn't matter. There was no safety. Hargrove pushed her toward a side door. "We have to move. We can't stay here." The moment he spoke, the church trembled. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shake. The wood creaked, and the walls groaned as though they were about to give way. Margaret's mind screamed at her to run, to get out, but her legs refused to obey. Her feet were frozen. The whispering was all around her now. Her heart beat faster, thundering in her chest. The growl, the deep, rumbling growl, had turned into a screech, a shriek of fury. Margaret looked up. A shadow fell over the doorway. Then it was there. Creature, no, not just one. There were more now. 3, 4, 5. They filled the doorway, their bodies impossibly tall, their limbs bent in unnatural angles. Their eyes burned with an insatiable hunger, glowing red in the dark. And their teeth, too many teeth, all sharp and glistening. The growl turned into a low hiss, like an animal preparing to pounce. Then they lunged. The villagers scattered. The creatures tore through the crowd like wolves through sheep, grabbing and clawing, their mouths wide, their arms stretching far too long. Margaret screamed, stumbling backward. Hargrove shoved her forward, urging her toward the door. But they were too slow. One of the creatures darted past them, knocking over a pew and sending it crashing into the stone floor. Its red eyes locked onto Margaret, and its twisted smile made her stomach churn. It was faster than she could react. She felt its breath, hot and sickly, as it reached for her. Then, a gunshot rang out. The creature stumbled backward with a horrific screech, and another shot followed. Hargrove fired again, sending the creature reeling. Staggered back, but didn't fall. Margaret's heart was racing. The darkness, the chaos, the creatures, it was all too much. She felt herself being pulled by Hargrove, her feet scrambling to keep up with his urgent pace. But there was no safety, no escape. The church, once a sanctuary, had become a tomb. The sound of gunshots and screams echoed, blending with the growling and hissing. The creatures were everywhere now, swarming over the villagers, tearing them apart. The air was thick with the stench of blood and death. The front doors of the church shook under the pressure of the creatures trying to break through. The wood groaned, splintering with every strike. Margaret felt a hand on her arm, pulling her toward the altar. She looked up, and there was a figure standing in the shadows. Elias Crow. His face was pale, his clothes torn, but there was something in his eyes, something that wasn't quite human. "What?" Margaret gasped, barely able to breathe. "You need to go," Elias said. His voice was hollow, empty, but there was urgency in it. "The barrier's gone. The creatures, they're free." Hargrove stepped forward, rifle raised, but Elias held up a hand. "No, you can't stop them now," Elias said, his voice trembling. "But you can still save yourselves. The ritual, there's still time. The lanterns." His words trailed off. "The lanterns?" Margaret asked, her mind struggling to keep up. Elias's eyes locked onto hers. They weren't just to keep the creatures away. They were to bind them, to hold them back. But they've been broken, and now... Suddenly, the door behind him splintered open, and the creatures poured through, flooding the room with their nightmare shapes. "No!" Elias shouted, but it was too late. The darkness consumed him in an instant. Then the world around Margaret collapsed. Margaret's world turned black. The last thing she remembered was a horrible, guttural cry, then the crushing weight of the darkness, and the creatures that were now free. The lanterns had failed them. The barrier was gone. And Black Hollow was no longer a place of refuge. Black Hollow was dying. In the chaos, there had been no time to mourn, no time to think. The creatures, those things that had been trapped for generations, were finally unleashed. The church had fallen, the last flickering remnants of hope extinguished in a matter of minutes. The night had swallowed them whole. Now only a handful of villagers were left. Margaret Holloway's mind felt numb as she stumbled through the woods, the cold air biting at her skin. Hargrove was beside her, though he looked just as lost as she felt. Their footsteps barely made a sound, drowned out by the faint whispering of the wind and the distant howls of the creatures that had claimed the village. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The terror of what had happened, what had been unleashed, lingered like a shadow. In the distance, the church bells rang, once, twice, and then fell silent. The ringing didn't bring comfort. It didn't signal safety. No, it was a reminder of what they had lost. The woods around them were dark, though not as dark as the night they'd just survived. The trees towered over them like silent sentinels, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The ground was soft beneath their feet, the earth damp from the cold. The moon was hidden, and only the faint glimmer of distant stars offered any guidance through the thick darkness. Margaret glanced at Hargrove, his face pale and drawn, his eyes hollow. He was still clutching his rifle, but she could see in his posture that it no longer mattered. He knew it. She knew it. The creatures had taken everything. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if she feared the woods would answer her with something worse than silence. Hargrove didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a heavy breath, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low. "We have to find a place to regroup." He stopped himself, as if the words didn't even matter. "We need to get as far away as we can. Away from that thing." Margaret shuddered. The image of those creatures was burned into her mind. Their long, spindly limbs, their two wide eyes, their grinning mouths. They were still out there, hunting them, tearing apart what was left of the village. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the woods, faint but unmistakable. Margaret froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Was it another creature? Another survivor? Hargrove's hand shot out, grabbing her arm and pulling her behind a tree. His rifle was raised. There was no sound for a moment, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. Margaret's breath caught. It was Elias Crow. Elias looked almost wrong. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt, his eyes wild. His skin was too pale, his movements stiff. He didn't look like the man they had known. He looked like someone or something that had been pulled from the depths of a nightmare. "Elias," Margaret whispered, stepping out from behind the tree. "Is it really you?" Elias's eyes flicked toward her, then to Hargrove, and for a moment, it seemed like he didn't recognize them at all. But then his gaze softened. I didn't think anyone else survived," he muttered, his voice rough, as though it hadn't been used in days or longer. Margaret didn't know how to respond. Her mind was still reeling from the horrors they had just witnessed. But Elias's appearance was something else entirely. Something had happened to him. "Where did you go?" Hargrove demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You left us. You left us to die." Elias flinched, as though the words struck him harder than he'd expected. He lowered his gaze and rubbed his face with a trembling hand. "I had no choice," he said, his voice cracking. I had to make sure it was too late." "Too late for what?" Margaret asked, her voice rising in frustration. "You promised us you'd protect the village. You promised the lanterns would keep the creatures out." But she couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. Elias lifted his head, his eyes dark and hollow. "The lanterns were never enough," he whispered. "They were just a temporary measure. A stopgap. The real barrier. It's underground." Margaret frowned. "Underground? What do you mean?" "I mean," Elias said slowly, "there's a system beneath the village. A place where the true seal was placed. The lanterns were just the surface of it. The real binding, the real protection. It was deeper, beneath the very ground we built our homes on. And that seal has been broken. It's over. We're all—" His voice faltered, and he suddenly collapsed to his knees, as though the weight of his words had physically crushed him. Margaret knelt beside him, grabbing his shoulder. "What happened? What happened to the seal?" "The creatures. They were never meant to be free," Elias said, his voice weak. "The barrier was broken the day I left. Couldn't stop it. I was too late." Hargrove's rifle dropped to the ground with a dull thud. "So what now?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. "What do we do now? The creatures are everywhere, and the village. Everything is gone. We don't have time for seals." Elias looked up at him, his expression grim. "You're right," he said softly. "But there's one thing we can still do." Elias stood, his body trembling. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand and motioned for Margaret and Hargrove to follow him. "We need to go to the old well," he said. It's the only place left where the barrier can be restored. The ritual must be completed there. The old well, Hargrove said, raising an eyebrow. I thought that was just a myth. No, Elias replied. It's real. And it's the key to saving what's left of this village. But we'll need to hurry. The creatures will be on us before long. Margaret felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of everything they had lost. Is there even time? She asked. Are we too late? Elias met her gaze, his eyes hard. We won't know until we try. But if we don't make it, there's nothing left for any of us. They set off through the woods again, their pace faster now, the urgency of Elias's words hanging over them like a cloud. The whispering had returned, a distant hum in the air. Margaret couldn't tell if it was real or just the sound of her own mind unraveling. The old well was deep in the woods, hidden among the trees. They reached it just as dawn began to break, the first light of day casting a pale glow over the clearing. Elias paused at the edge of the well, his face set. This is it, he said. The ritual must be done before the sun rises fully. Margaret looked at Hargrove, whose expression was grim but determined. They had come this far. There was no turning back now. As Elias began the incantations, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The air thickened, a palpable tension hanging in the air. The creatures were close, too close, and then a distant scream echoed through the trees. It was coming from the village, and it was the scream of someone they knew. The scream echoed through the trees, sending a shock of terror down Margaret's spine. It was unmistakable, human, raw, and desperate. A cry that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It was coming from the village. It was someone they knew. No! Elias shouted, his voice tight with panic. They found us. We're too late. Margaret felt her stomach drop. Hargrove immediately grabbed her arm, his grip tight. We have to finish the ritual, he urged, his voice low, but urgent. We can't let them stop us now. Elias stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the old well. His hands trembled at his sides, his face pale. He looked like he was torn between the desperate need to save the village and the crushing realization that they were too far gone. But the scream had shattered any hope of retreating into the past. The creatures were already at the village. There was no going back now. We can't waste any more time, Hargrove said, his voice hard, pressing forward despite the terror. He pulled Margaret closer to the well, the ritual beginning to take form around them. Elias's voice came, barely a whisper, as he kneeled next to the well. This is the only chance we have to seal them again. We have to make it work. Even if it costs everything. Margaret's mind raced. She wanted to scream, to run toward the village, to find whoever was still alive. But Elias was already starting the incantation. The wind around them picked up, and the first rays of the sun broke through the trees, casting an eerie glow on the clearing. The pressure was building. The creatures were closing in. They could hear the faint sound of snarling in the distance, getting closer with each passing second. Elias raised his arms, speaking words that felt older than the earth itself. Margaret could feel a strange pull, something unnatural, as if the land itself was shifting beneath her feet. The world seemed to hold its breath. But the moment was fragile, like a thread that could snap at any moment. Then, with a loud crack, the ground beneath them trembled violently. Margaret lost her balance, stumbling, but Hargrove caught her before she could fall. What's happening? She gasped. It's the seal, Elias said, his voice strained. The creatures, they know what we're trying to do. They're fighting it. The air grew heavy, and the earth shook harder, like a warning from the very depths of the world. The howls from the village grew louder, and then, through the trees, they saw it. A figure, tall and monstrous, emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. It was one of them. It's too late, Elias whispered, his voice thick with despair. They're coming. Margaret's heart pounded. She could barely breathe as she watched the creature approach. It moved with unnatural speed, its long limbs stretching far beyond human proportions. The ground around it seemed to darken, as though the very earth was rotting beneath its feet. Hargrove didn't hesitate. He lifted his rifle, but his aim was shaky. "Get behind me," he ordered. "No!" Elias shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. "We can't fight them. We need to finish the ritual, or they'll destroy everything." The creature was getting closer, its gaping mouth dripping with saliva. It snarled, and the trees around it twisted and groaned, as if they, too, were alive with fear. Margaret knew they didn't have much time. But the ritual wasn't finished yet. The seal hadn't been restored. With a cry, Elias threw himself to the ground beside the well, his hands pressed against the earth. His words grew louder, desperate, as if he was calling to something far below them. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries. The creature lunged, but just as it reached them, something snapped. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, and an ear-piercing sound erupted from the well. It was as if the earth itself had split, the ground shuddering with the force of something powerful being unleashed. A blast of light erupted from the well, pushing the creature back, its monstrous form screeching in fury as the light wrapped around it, binding it in place. For a moment, everything went still. The creature writhed and shrieked, but it couldn't move, its body locked in place by the power of the ritual. The air felt thick with tension as the light from the well began to pulse, brighter and brighter, until it enveloped the creature entirely. Then, with a final, desperate scream, the creature collapsed into the ground, vanishing into the earth. But it wasn't over. Margaret's heart raced as she looked around, expecting the worst. But instead of an immediate attack, a strange calm settled over the clearing. The oppressive darkness seemed to lift, though the ground still trembled beneath them. But they weren't alone. From the shadows of the trees, more figures appeared, more of the monstrous creatures. Their eyes glowed, their jaws snapping, but something was different. The creatures seemed confused, disoriented. "No," Elias muttered, his face paling even further. "It's too late. The seal wasn't enough. It won't hold them forever." Hargrove cursed under his breath, his eyes scanning the woods for any signs of movement. The creatures were still coming, their numbers growing, their eyes filled with an insatiable hunger. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking. "You said the ritual was supposed to stop them." Elias's face was etched with defeat. "It was never meant to be permanent. The seal was meant to hold them back, to keep them contained for a time, but as long as the barrier beneath the village is broken, they will keep coming. They'll keep hunting." Margaret's heart sank. She could feel the weight of his words, the truth that was too terrible to bear. Suddenly, there was another scream, closer now and unmistakable. "Father Mathis," Margaret whispered. Hargrove spun around, his rifle raised again. "We need to move. Now." Elias's eyes burned with a quiet intensity. "There's one place we haven't tried. The hollow. It's a last resort, but it may be the only way to stop them for good." "The hollow?" Margaret asked, confused. "Where?" Elias didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began to lead them deeper into the woods, his steps quick and purposeful. They followed, though Margaret's mind raced, wondering what he meant. The woods were thick now, the trees heavy with the fog that had rolled in. The further they went, the darker it became. The faint howl of the creatures could still be heard in the distance. But now, there was something else, something worse. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the air felt thick with dread. At last, Elias stopped in front of a massive stone structure, tall, ancient, and covered in moss. The stone was carved with symbols, deep and worn, almost as if they had been carved by hands long forgotten. "This is it," Elias said, his voice tight with fear. "The hollow." Margaret took a hesitant step forward. "What is this place?" Elias turned to face her, his eyes shadowed with something dark. "This is where the real ritual took place, where the first barrier was set. If we can reach the heart of it, we can finish what we started. But we need to be quick. We're running out of time." Before Margaret could respond, the ground beneath their feet rumbled, and a loud crash echoed through the trees. The creatures were getting closer, faster. Hargrove grabbed her arm. pulling her toward the entrance of the hollow. "We have to move," he said, urgency in his voice. As they entered the hollow, the darkness closed in around them. The stone walls seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, an energy that was both terrifying and exhilarating. But as they moved deeper, they heard something that made their blood run cold. It wasn't the creatures. It was someone else. "No, no, please." It was a voice Margaret recognized. The voice she had feared hearing. It was Father Mathis. The air inside the hollow felt thicker, colder, as if they had stepped into a place untouched by time. The stone walls rose high above them, their surface covered in centuries of moss and vines. It seemed as though the very earth had forgotten this place, and yet, the power that emanated from it was unmistakable. The voice, Father Mathis's voice, echoed through the darkened space, sending a chill through Margaret's veins. She clenched her fists, trying to steady herself, but her heart raced with dread. "No, no, please." The voice faltered, cracked with desperation. Margaret's pulse quickened. "Father Mathis," she whispered, barely hearing her own words in the oppressive silence. Elias had already begun moving forward, his eyes scanning the shadows. He didn't answer her, but the tension in his posture was palpable. Hargrove stayed close to her, his hand never leaving his rifle, though. He too seemed on edge. "We have to hurry," Elias muttered. His voice was tight with urgency. "The creatures are already too close. If we don't reach the heart of the hollow in time, everything we've done will be for nothing." Margaret nodded but couldn't tear her eyes away from the dark expanse ahead. The hollow seemed to stretch forever, the walls twisting at odd angles, making it hard to tell where the path truly began and where it ended. And Father Mathis's voice. It was growing fainter, but it was still there, a constant reminder of the horrors that lay in wait. "Father Mathis," Margaret called again, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Where are you?" The reply came, but it wasn't the voice she had hoped for. It was distorted, like something not quite human. The words were slurred, as though the speaker was struggling to form them. "Help me. It's too late. They've taken me." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The hollow's deep darkness seemed to close in on her, and for the briefest moment, Margaret felt a creeping sensation at the back of her neck. Something was watching them. Something ancient, something that had been waiting in the shadows for far too long. Elias's pace quickened, though his face remained grim. He had been in this place before, of that Margaret was certain. But what had brought him back here? What was it that he knew about the hollow that they didn't? The stone floor beneath their feet was uneven, jagged, as if the earth had split open eons ago. The path seemed to twist, leading them deeper into the hollow, where the shadows were darkest. There was no sound except for the faint echoes of their footsteps and the distant howls of the creatures that had been drawn to the village. The air felt thick with something heavy, almost suffocating. Elias stopped abruptly, raising a hand to signal for them to halt. He turned, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "We're close," he said quietly, "but you need to understand something before we go any further. The hollow, it's not just a place. It's a prison, a trap. The first barrier was placed here, and the creatures, the things we've been running from, are bound to it." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Are you saying the creatures are trapped here?" "No," Elias answered, his voice tight. "They were bound here, long ago, by the first settlers of the village. This place was meant to keep them locked away forever. But when the seal beneath the village was broken, it weakened everything. The creatures have started to break free. That's why they've returned." Margaret swallowed hard. "And we can stop them? By doing what?" Elias's face twisted in frustration. "By finishing the ritual. The final step. But it's not easy. There's a reason this place was hidden away for so long. If we fail, the consequences won't just be for Black Hollow. It'll be for the entire land. The creatures will be free, and they will consume everything." Hargrove glanced nervously at the shadows. "So, if we fail, what happens?" Elias's gaze was grim. "Then we die. All of us. And so does everything we know. The weight of his words settled on them like a blanket of dread. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as they continued forward, the path narrowing ahead. She could barely see where it ended, but she knew they had to keep moving. They reached a large opening, and Margaret's breath hitched as she looked into the chamber before them. It was vast. The walls were covered in ancient carvings, symbols that twisted and turned like serpents, their meanings long lost to time. At the center of the room, there was a large stone altar, covered in what appeared to be old, dried blood. The air was thick with a strange, acrid scent, and the shadows seemed to dance around them, as though alive. Father Mathis's voice echoed once more, but this time it was clearer, almost like a scream. "Help me, please." Elias turned to face them, his expression haunted. "It's too late for him. We need to focus on the ritual." Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. She could hear the desperation in Father Mathis's voice, the terror that laced each word. But Elias was right. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. Elias approached the altar, his eyes scanning the symbols carved into the stone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered book, its pages yellowed with age. He flipped through it quickly, his fingers trembling as he searched for the right incantation. Hargrove's gaze flicked to Margaret, then to Elias. "Is this it? Is this how we finish it?" Elias nodded without looking up. "This is the final part, the heart of the ritual. If we can finish it, we can restore the seal. We can contain the creatures once more." Margaret watched him with a mix of fear and hope. The creatures were getting closer. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. There was no time to waste. Elias began to speak, his voice low and steady. The words he spoke were ancient, a language Margaret couldn't understand, but the air around them seemed to shift with each syllable. The stone beneath them vibrated, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, more menacing. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, with a loud crack, the stone floor beneath them split open, and a cold, bone-chilling wind rushed up from the depths. Margaret staggered back, her breath coming in short gasps as the temperature plummeted. The wind was like ice, cutting through her clothes, but Elias didn't falter. He continued to speak the incantation, his voice growing louder, more desperate. The shadows began to twist, their forms shifting and stretching like tendrils reaching for the altar. Margaret could hear them now, the faint, whispering voices of the creatures. They were close, so close. Suddenly, there was a loud, deafening roar from the darkness. The wind howled, and the altar began to glow with an eerie, unnatural light. The shadows in the room thickened, their shapes becoming clearer, long, twisted limbs, eyes that gleamed with malice. The creatures were here. "We're almost there," Elias shouted, his voice straining. "Just a little longer." Margaret felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end as the creatures began to emerge from the shadows, their glowing eyes fixated on them. The room was filling with an unnatural presence, the air thick with malice. But just as the ritual seemed to reach its climax, something unexpected happened. The altar began to crack. A loud, sickening sound filled the chamber, and the stone beneath them split wide open, sending a shockwave of energy through the air. The creatures shrieked in unison, their eyes wide with horror. "No!" Elias shouted, his voice filled with panic. "It's breaking. We're too late." And then, from the depths of the hollow, something massive and dark emerged. It was the thing they had been afraid of all along. The heart of the hollow had awoken. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the creature, the heart of the hollow, emerged from the depths. It was unlike anything Margaret had ever seen, an enormous, writhing mass of shadows and darkness that seemed to feed on the very light of the world around it. Its form was impossible to comprehend, shifting in ways that defied the natural laws of space and time. It had no true shape, only a pulsating, dark core that seemed to pull everything toward it. The air grew thick with an oppressive force, suffocating them as it took shape. Its very presence seemed to push the air out of their lungs, each breath harder to take. The light from the altar flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls, making the creature seem even larger, more terrifying. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. The creature's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed a sickly yellow, watching them with an intelligence that was both ancient and predatory. It wasn't just an animal. It was something far worse. Something that had existed for longer than the village, longer than the earth itself. "We have to stop it," Margaret gasped, her voice shaking. Elias didn't respond immediately. He was still standing before the altar, his hands raised as if holding onto the ritual's fragile threads. Sweat poured down his face, and his eyes were wide with fear. "We don't have time," he finally said, his voice strained. "If the heart is free, the seal is broken. The creatures will come, and there will be nothing left of the village. Nothing left of us." Hargrove stepped forward, his rifle in hand, his face set with grim determination. "Then let's finish it. Now." But Elias shook his head. "We can't fight it with force. The heart doesn't exist in the same way we do. Can't be destroyed by bullets or fire. It's—" "Then what do we do?" Margaret interrupted, panic rising in her chest. She could feel the weight of the creature's gaze on her, a pull that threatened to drag her into its depths. Elias's eyes flickered to the ancient book in his hands. He turned the pages frantically, his fingers trembling. "There's one more step to the ritual, the final incantation. But we need to draw it in, make it vulnerable. We have to weaken it first." The shadows around the heart pulsed with a low hum, like a heartbeat in the earth itself. The ground cracked open further, and the wind that had been howling through the hollow grew stronger, colder. The creature's form continued to shift, its limbs stretching out impossibly far, as if it was trying to reach for them, to crush them beneath its weight. Margaret's heart raced as she watched the creature. No, the heart shift again. It was growing larger with each passing second. The darkness around it seemed to grow deeper, more insidious, pulling everything in. The stone walls of the hollow groaned under the pressure, and the air was so thick with tension that it felt like it might snap at any moment. "We need to weaken it. We have to draw it in," Elias repeated, his voice a whisper now, barely audible over the shrieking wind. "The ritual can't work if it's too strong. If it gets to its full power, we'll all be lost." Hargrove's eyes narrowed as he took aim at the creature's center, but Elias held up a hand, stopping him. "No, don't shoot. We need to use the light. We need to turn the ritual's power against it." Margaret turned toward Elias, desperate. "The light?" Elias nodded, his face pale with fear. "The heart of the hollow feeds on darkness. The more light we can generate, the more it will be forced to contract. The ritual, it's tied to the balance of light and dark. If we flood it with enough light, we can drive it back long enough to finish the incantation." Margaret's eyes darted around the chamber, the walls now pulsating with energy. The creature's form was rapidly expanding, a black void reaching out toward them. But the altar still glowed with that eerie light. She made a decision. "We can use the altar. The symbols, they're tied to the ritual. If we can redirect the power through the carvings, we can focus it on the heart." Elias's eyes locked onto hers. "It's risky. The heart is unstable. If we don't act quickly, we'll be consumed by it." Hargrove took a step back, glancing over at Margaret. "We don't have much time." The wind howled louder, and the ground beneath them shook again. The creature's form loomed closer, stretching its dark limbs toward them. Margaret could see its tendrils reaching, curling around the altar. It was drawing closer, faster than she had anticipated. "Now!" Elias shouted. "Focus the light, draw it toward the symbols. Make the heart take it in." Margaret sprinted forward, her feet barely making a sound as she moved. She reached the altar and pressed her hands to the stone, feeling the vibrations beneath her palms. The symbols carved into it were ancient, worn with time, but they were still alive with power. She could feel it, a pulse that resonated deep within her bones. She closed her eyes and focused, trying to connect with the energy of the altar. A surge of heat flooded her palms, and the symbols beneath her hands began to glow. The light that had been dormant in the stone was awakening, slowly at first, Then with greater intensity. The creature, the heart, let out a terrible, shrieking noise, its form writhing in response to the light. It wasn't happy. It was struggling, pulling back, but the energy from the altar was drawing it in, forcing it to weaken. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she poured all of her focus into the symbols. She could feel the darkness pulling at her, trying to drag her down into its depths, but she refused to let go. "Hurry," Elias shouted, his voice full of desperation. She nodded, her teeth gritted as she continued. The light grew brighter, sharper, and the shadows around the heart began to shrink back, recoiling from the brightness. The creature's limbs twitched, and its growls became more erratic. Margaret could hear it now, the sound of the heart, the real heart, pounding in the very walls of the hollow. It was too close, too powerful. They had to finish it. They had to act before it regained control. Suddenly, the stone beneath her hands cracked, sending a wave of energy through her body. She screamed, a shock of pain shooting through her arms, but she refused to release her hold. The light exploded outward in a brilliant flash. The creature howled in fury as the light surged forward, wrapping around it, burning the shadows away. Its form flickered, its monstrous limbs beginning to disintegrate as the light consumed it. The heart was being forced back, collapsing under the pressure of the ritual. But just as Margaret thought they had succeeded, a new sound filled the hollow. It was low, rumbling, and filled with a horrible, otherworldly power. The altar began to crack, the ground splitting further as the heart fought back with renewed strength. "No," Elias whispered, his face pale with terror. "It's too late. It's not enough." The light flickered, then died. And then all at once the heart roared. The ground shook violently beneath them as the hollow came alive. The creature's true form, its heart, split open in an explosion of darkness, sending shockwaves through the chamber. The force of it threw Margaret back, and she crashed to the ground. A dark, crushing weight pressed down on her, and the air around her became thick with the stench of decay and death. The heart had not been defeated. It had only been delayed. The creatures, the true creatures, were coming, and they would not stop until they had claimed everything. The hollow was alive. Its dark heart beat in sync with the rumbling of the earth, sending tremors through the chamber. The stone walls groaned as if they were being torn apart from within. Margaret's breath came in sharp, painful gasps as she scrambled to her feet, struggling against the suffocating weight of the air. Elias's face was pale, his eyes wide with horror. He reached for her, pulling her away from the altar as the floor beneath them cracked open. "We have to move now." Hargrove's voice echoed from behind them, his tone laced with urgency. "What the hell is happening? What did we do?" The heart of the hollow pulsed with an unnatural force. The air shimmered as shadows swirled, spiraling outward like tendrils seeking to consume them. The altar, once a beacon of light, was now a dark, crumbling ruin. The symbols had faded, their glow extinguished by the overwhelming power of the heart. The ritual was failing. Margaret's mind raced. The heart, the creature that had once been bound beneath the earth, wasn't just a force of nature. It was an ancient entity, a consciousness that had existed long before the village was built. And now it was free. "There's no time," Elias said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "We have to finish the ritual before it's too late." "But," Margaret began, her voice trembling, "the light, it was working. Why is it back?" Elias gripped her shoulder, his fingers digging into her skin with painful intensity. "The heart is ancient. It's too powerful to be contained by the ritual alone. We need something more. We need its power." Margaret's eyes widened in confusion. "Its power? What do you mean? What can we possibly use to fight something like that?" Hargrove, who had been scanning the room, his rifle still clutched tightly in his hands, cursed under his breath. "This isn't a damn fight, Elias. It's a war." Elias's gaze locked with Margaret's. His eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and determination. The ritual, it was never meant to destroy the heart. It was meant to contain it. But the seal that held it in place has weakened. Now we need to bind it again. We need to sacrifice something. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. What are you saying? Elias's voice dropped to a whisper. We need to offer the heart something it craves. The blood of one of us. The ritual requires a sacrifice to complete. Without it, the creatures will flood the earth. The entire land will be consumed. Hargrove's face twisted in disbelief. You're talking about... Elias nodded, his face hardening. We don't have a choice. The only way to stop this is to offer something it will accept. Margaret's mind spun. The choice was impossible. To sacrifice one of them, the weight of it pressed down on her like a physical force. But there was no other option. They had come this far, and if they didn't finish the ritual, they would all die anyway. Hargrove took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. I'll do it. No, Margaret shook her head, her voice sharp. No one is dying for this. We'll find another way. Elias's face was grim. There is no other way. The heart has tasted blood. It won't stop until it gets more. The ritual is the only thing that can seal it, but it requires a sacrifice. Then you do it, Margaret snapped, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. You know more about this than any of us. Why are you putting this on us? Elias didn't flinch. He stared at her, his face etched with sorrow. I can't. I've already done my part. The ritual will not work unless one of you is willing to give up everything. Margaret's mind raced. The situation was impossible. But she couldn't let Elias sacrifice himself. He had already led them this far. It had to be one of them, someone else. But who? We don't have time, Elias said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. We need to choose, and we need to do it now. The longer we wait, the stronger the heart will become. Margaret's mind swirled with panic, but then she remembered something. Something small but crucial. I remember the first ritual, she said, her voice quiet but resolute. The one the villagers did to bind the heart in the first place. They didn't just offer blood. They gave it a piece of their soul. They took their memories, their very essence, and offered it to the heart. That's what sealed it. Elias's eyes narrowed. That's the key, he said slowly. The heart doesn't just crave blood. Craves souls, memories, life itself. We can still complete the ritual, but it will take everything. We can bind it again, but it's not just a physical sacrifice. We'll lose a part of ourselves, forever. Margaret's heart dropped into her stomach. The price was unimaginable. Part of themselves gone, never to return. But it was their only chance. What if... Hargrove began, his voice tight. What if we each give a piece of ourselves? Will that weaken the heart enough? Elias's expression softened, but there was no trace of hope in his eyes. No, it has to be one person, one life, one soul. Margaret swallowed, her mouth dry. The wind howled around them, and the darkness seemed to press in from every direction. The heart pulsed with growing power, each beat louder than the last. I'll do it, she whispered. Elias's eyes flashed with alarm. No, Margaret. I'll do it, she said again, more firmly this time. She didn't know where the courage was coming from, but the weight of their choices was clear. You've already brought us this far. I won't let you sacrifice yourself. If anyone's going to do this, it's me. Hargrove stepped back, his face a mask of conflicted emotion. Are you sure? This isn't something you can come back from. Margaret nodded, her resolve hardening. She had no choice. It was either this or the destruction of everything. The creatures would be free, and the heart would grow stronger until nothing remained. She couldn't let that happen. Elias opened his mouth to protest, but Margaret raised a hand to stop him. This is the only way. I'll finish it. A long silence hung in the air. The wind howled louder, and the earth trembled beneath their feet as the heart's power surged once more. But despite the chaos, Margaret felt strangely calm. This was the only way. Elias nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then we do it together. He turned to the altar and began to speak the ancient incantation once more, his voice steady and firm. Margaret stepped forward, placing her hands on the altar, feeling the pulsing energy beneath her palms. Hargrove stood back, his rifle lowered, his expression filled with regret, but also a strange acceptance. The shadows grew darker, thicker, the heart of the hollow thrashing in the depths of the earth as if it knew what was coming. Margaret closed her eyes, her heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of the heart, the pulse of darkness that had been sealed for so long. Now Elias whispered. With a final, deep breath, Margaret began the incantation. The light from the altar flared, and the air itself seemed to shudder. The heart screamed as the power of the ritual flooded it, drawing the darkness into the stone. Margaret felt herself slipping, her consciousness fading as the energy consumed her, but she held on. She had to. The heart's power pulled, tearing at her very soul, but she held fast. The shadows writhed and twisted, but the light from the altar kept it at bay. And then, with a final burst of energy, the light consumed the heart. The ground trembled one last time, and then everything went silent. A deafening silence filled the hollow. The ground, once trembling beneath them, was now still. The shadows that had twisted and writhed moments before were gone, pulled back into the heart of the hollow, sealed away once more. Margaret collapsed to the ground, her breath shallow, her vision blurred. The altar, which had pulsed with eerie light, was now dark and cold beneath her fingertips. It was over, or at least it should have been. Elias knelt beside her, his voice distant and hollow. "Margaret, can you hear me?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. A terrible emptiness had settled in her chest, a void where something had once been. She could feel it, or rather, she could feel the absence of it. A part of her was missing. She had given herself to the ritual, her memories, her soul. She should have been dead, but she wasn't. Hargrove stood a few feet away, his rifle hanging limply at his side. His face was pale, his expression grim. "She's breathing, but she doesn't look right." Margaret's fingers twitched as she slowly tried to push herself up, her body trembling. She felt wrong, lightheaded, disconnected. The world around her looked different somehow, duller, faded, like a painting left too long in the sun. She turned to Elias, her voice hoarse. "Did it work?" Elias hesitated, studying her with an unreadable expression. "The heart is sealed again," he said carefully. For now. For now." Margaret's stomach twisted at those words. She glanced around. The walls of the hollow were cracked and scarred from the battle, but they held firm. The air no longer carried that oppressive weight of darkness. The creatures, the horrors that had clawed their way toward freedom, were gone. But the feeling in her chest told her something wasn't right. Elias must have seen the doubt in her eyes because he reached out, placing a hesitant hand on her shoulder. "You did what had to be done." Margaret swallowed hard. She should have felt relief, victory, something other than this numbing void. But all she felt was loss. "What did I lose?" she whispered. Elias's expression darkened. "I don't know." That terrified her more than anything. The walk back to the village was slow and silent. The forest, once a place of creeping shadows and whispered voices, now felt empty. No movement in the underbrush, no howling wind. It was unnatural, dead. Margaret kept her arms wrapped around herself, trying to shake the deep cold that had settled in her bones. No matter how much she tried to focus, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been ripped away from her. She couldn't remember what it was. The village came into view through the thinning trees, its lanterns still flickering in the early dawn light. But something was wrong. The streets were empty. Not a single soul stirred. Hargrove tightened his grip on his rifle. "Where the hell is everyone?" Elias frowned, his eyes scanning the silent houses. "They should be here. The lanterns are still burning." A prickle of unease crept up Margaret's spine. The village had been on the brink of destruction. If the ritual had worked, they should have been met with relief, people running out to greet them, celebrating their survival. But there was nothing. No voices, no movement, just silence. Margaret's hands curled into fists. She turned to Elias. "Tell me the truth. What did we really do back there?" Elias's jaw tightened. "We sealed the heart. But at what cost?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step forward, toward the village square. Margaret and Hargrove followed, their movements cautious, their breath tight in their chests. As they rounded the corner of the main street, they saw the first figure. An old woman stood in the center of the square, her back to them. She was completely still, her face turned toward the sky. Her body was rigid, unnatural, as if frozen in place. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Mrs. Calloway?" she called hesitantly. The old woman didn't move. Elias moved ahead cautiously. "Something's wrong." Margaret forced herself to step closer, dread crawling through her veins. The moment she got near enough to see the woman's face, she wished she hadn't. Mrs. Calloway's eyes were open, but they were empty. Not blind, not dead, just gone. Her mouth was slightly open, as if caught mid-breath. But no air moved through her lips, no rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, but she wasn't there. Margaret stumbled back, her pulse roaring in her ears. "What the hell is this?" Hargrove's voice was sharp with panic. "Is she?" Before he could finish, another figure emerged from a nearby doorway. A man this time, Mr. Henshaw, the village blacksmith. He walked slowly, his feet dragging against the dirt. His arms hung limply at his sides, his face blank. And then more came. One by one, the villagers appeared from their homes. Each of them the same. Eyes empty, bodies moving as though guided by unseen strings. Margaret's stomach lurched. This isn't possible. Elias's face had gone completely pale. "They're hollow." Margaret turned to him sharply. "What do you mean, hollow?" Elias swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Their souls, they're gone." A sharp, bitter cold wrapped around Margaret's chest. Gone. The heart hadn't just taken a piece of her. It had taken all of them. The ritual had worked, but the village had paid the price. Hargrove ran a shaking hand through his hair. "Tell me how to fix this," he demanded, his voice rough with anger. "Tell me this isn't permanent." Elias looked down at his hands. I don't know." Margaret's mind reeled. She had thought she was the only one who had lost something in that chamber. But the truth was far worse. The village had been saved from destruction. But it had been emptied. Their neighbors, their friends, their families, they were all still here. But they weren't them anymore. Margaret's breath came in shallow gasps. The villagers stood in eerie silence, staring at nothing. No fear, no emotion, no recognition. Hargrove cursed, stepping back. I don't know what to do." Margaret felt numb. The cold inside her chest was spreading, wrapping itself around her thoughts. "This is my fault," she whispered. Elias shook his head. "No, it's ours." The sky above the village was beginning to brighten with the first light of dawn. But there was no warmth to it, no comfort. They had fought to save the village from the horrors beneath the earth. And in doing so, they had created a horror of their own. The heart of the hollow was sealed. But the village was dead in a way far worse than death. Margaret turned her gaze back to the empty-eyed faces of the people she had once known. And for the first time since the nightmare began, she wished they had failed. The village stood frozen in eerie silence. The people, Margaret's friends, neighbors and family, wandered the streets like lifeless shadows, their eyes blank, their souls missing. Margaret's chest felt hollow, a cold emptiness settling where her heart should be. The ritual had sealed the heart beneath the earth. But at what cost? Elias had warned her. The heart didn't just hunger for blood, it craved souls. And now the village had paid the price. Margaret turned to Elias, her voice barely a whisper. "Is there any way to undo this?" Elias looked down at his hands, his face lined with exhaustion. "I don't know." Hargrove swore under his breath, gripping his rifle tighter. "There's gotta be something. Some way to bring them back." Margaret scanned the empty faces around her. There was no fear, no pain, just an unnatural stillness. No one deserved this. "I won't accept this," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We came here to save them, not leave them as empty husks." Elias met her gaze, something flickering in his tired eyes. "There may be one last way, but it's dangerous." Margaret exhaled sharply. "Of course it is. Tell me." Elias hesitated. Then, in a hushed tone, he said, "The lanterns." Margaret's brows furrowed. "What?" "The lantern keeper's job wasn't just to keep the village safe from the dark," Elias explained. "The lanterns were tied to the heart itself. They were a link between the village and the ritual. That's why the village stayed untouched for so long." Hargrove scoffed. "And how does that help us now?" Elias took a slow breath. "If the heart took the souls, the lanterns might still hold them." Margaret's stomach twisted. "You mean, if we can relight them the right way, we might be able to return what was taken?" Elias nodded. "It's a risk. If we do it wrong, the heart might take everything." Margaret turned toward the lanterns lining the village streets. They still flickered, casting weak pools of light. But something about them felt off, as if they weren't connected anymore. She clenched her fists. "We don't have a choice." The three of them worked quickly, gathering what they needed. The lantern keeper's hut, long abandoned, held old tomes and supplies that had been left behind. Among them, Elias found a bundle of special oil that had been infused with the light of the original ritual centuries ago. Margaret held the small flask in her hands, feeling its weight. "This is it." Elias nodded. "Once we light the lanterns with this, it should forge a connection to the heart again. But someone has to guide the souls back." Margaret inhaled sharply. She already knew what that meant. "I'll do it." Hargrove's head snapped toward her. "Hell no. You already gave up enough. Let him do it." He jerked a thumb toward Elias. Elias shook his head. "I can't. The heart knows me. I've been fighting it for too long. If I try, it'll shut me out. Margaret is the only one who has already touched it." Touched it. Margaret's chest tightened. The hollowness inside her. Was that why? Had she already become part of the heart's hunger? She didn't want to think about it. "Just tell me what to do," she said. Elias took a deep breath. "When the lanterns are lit, you need to call them back. Focus on the souls. You have to guide them home." But his expression darkened. "If the heart resists, it might try to keep you instead." Margaret forced a small, wry smile. "Figures." Hargrove placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this." But she did. Margaret nodded, and the three of them set to work. One by one, they filled the lanterns with the sacred oil. The flames flickered, turning from a dull orange to an eerie, shimmering white. And then the wind shifted. Margaret shivered. The air grew thick, the weight of something ancient pressing down on her shoulders. It was time. She closed her eyes, and she reached out. First there was nothing. Then a whisper. Not words, just presence. 1,000 voices, all lost, all waiting in the dark. Margaret's mind swayed, her body cold and weightless. She wasn't standing in the village anymore. She was somewhere else. The heart's domain. A vast, endless void stretched around her. Wisps of light floated in the darkness. Fragments of souls, trapped between worlds. She reached for them, but the void shifted. A low, guttural growl echoed in the abyss. It doesn't want to let them go. Margaret grit her teeth. They don't belong to you. A shadow swirled in front of her. A monstrous form made of writhing tendrils and glowing, hungry eyes. The heart. You fed me. The voice was not a sound, but a feeling that rattled in her bones. You belong to me now. Margaret's heart pounded. No, I belong to them. She reached out again, this time with all the strength she had left. She pulled. The souls quivered, as if waking from a long sleep. One by one, they began to move, drifting toward her, drawn by her call. The heart screamed. Darkness lashed out, wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into the void. Cold seeped into her veins, and for a moment, she thought she would drown in it. But then, a light, brilliant and warm, it erupted from the lanterns, cutting through the dark like a blade. The heart writhed, recoiling. The souls surged forward, slipping from its grasp. Margaret pushed harder, guiding them home. The darkness cracked, and then, everything shattered. Margaret's eyes snapped open. She was on the ground, gasping for breath. Hargrove was shaking her. his face hovering inches from hers. "Margaret! Damn it! Say something!" She sucked in a ragged breath, her vision spinning. And then, a sound. A murmur. A rustling of movement. Margaret turned her head and saw the villagers blinking in confusion, their gazes clearing. One by one, they stumbled, clutching their heads as if waking from a long, dark sleep. Mrs. Calloway let out a soft gasp. Mr. Henshaw rubbed his temples, looking around in bewilderment. They were back. Margaret let out a shaky laugh, relief crashing over her. Elias exhaled, his shoulders sagging. It worked. Hargrove sat back, rubbing his face. Holy hell! The village was alive again. Margaret felt warmth return to her chest, the emptiness fading. The heart was sealed. The people were saved. For the first time in what felt like forever, the nightmare was over. Days passed, and the village slowly returned to normal. The people didn't remember much, only strange dreams and a deep, unshakable fear of the dark. Margaret stood at the edge of the lantern square, watching the flames flicker. Elias approached, standing beside her. "The village will need a new lantern keeper," he said softly. Margaret exhaled. Yeah, she already knew. It had to be her. She had touched the darkness. She had called the souls home. And now she would keep the lanterns burning. Forever. As night fell, Margaret picked up the oil canister and walked to the first lantern, setting its flame aglow. The light flickered. The village slept peacefully. And Margaret, the last lantern keeper, stood watch.